Okay, video number 5 here for Unit 5. We're going to talk about neuron networking. So I've been mentioning that neurons have to communicate with each other. They communicate with each other through those synapses that we've learned about earlier. And so here we're going to talk a little bit more about neuron networking and how that happens. So I mentioned, so some of this we've kind of talked about before, but what this is showing you here is a very simple example of neuron networking. So as we've already learned about earlier, you have now these little diagrams that you're seeing, the little dots on those diagrams, those are cell bodies of neurons, and then the long stretches here, those are axons, nerve fibers. There we go. A little stylus does not want to write. And then on the end where you see those little V's like that on these diagrams, those are supposed to be the secretory ends of the axon where neurotransmitters are being released. So that's typically what you'll see in these neuron networking diagrams. And so as we've already talked about, within your nervous system, you have sensory neurons, incoming information from out in the periphery. Maybe I'll change over here to red. Or maybe try a different color here, maybe green for a while. And then you've got outgoing information over here from the central nervous system out to muscles, glands, internal organs, whatever it may be. And the central nervous system has to process that. So bridging the two, you have interneurons. So generally with these types of things, you've got incoming information travels up the PNS to the CNS. The CNS has lots of communication between neurons that happens there. And then your central nervous system makes decisions about responses, effects that need to take place, like contracting muscles, a gland needs to secrete, things like that. So a very simplistic example of networking, there are things called reflexes, spinal reflexes, that actually happen through your spinal cord without involving the brain, and that's what they're showing you an example of here. And we'll see a couple of more detailed examples of reflexes later. But the most simplistic type of or communication circuit that you can have is an incoming stimulus along a sensory neuron. That sensory neuron secretes neurotransmitters that stimulates an interneuron. This is a bridging neuron there in the spinal cord. That interneuron generates an action potential if it reaches threshold, secretes neurotransmitters, which then stimulate this motor neuron that then generates an action potential that travels down to whatever that motor neuron is in control of. Could be a skeletal muscle fiber, or it could be a gland, whatever it may be that motor neuron is supposed to control. And that's going to lead to a response. So that's a very simplistic example of neuron networking. In reality, this networking between, you've got these incoming impulses that stimulate interneurons in the spinal cord, but then they've got to send information up to the brain, and you have networking between neurons in the brain that are going to process that information. They're going to send impulses back down to the motor neurons that are going to then send out their impulses to stimulate whatever it is that needs to generate a response. Okay, so a little bit more about neuron networking here, and here we're zooming in a little bit more detail into, this is a cross section through the spinal cord like we were looking at on the last slide. You've got spinal nerves that branch off of the spinal cord. Your spinal nerves, all right, so as they approach the spinal cord, as you see here, they actually divide up into two branches. Those two branches are called roots. So on the back side, you have the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and on the anterior side, you have the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Okay, and your sensory afferent axons, they travel through the dorsal root like this as they enter the spinal cord. the axons of your motor neurons head out through the ventral root on the anterior or the ventral side. Now then, once you reach the main part of the spinal nerve itself, those axons of the sensory and the motor neurons can be bundled together, but they do split apart there just before you reach the spinal cord itself. You have that division into a dorsal root and a ventral root. All right, and if you notice here, you have this bulge on the dorsal root. The reason you have a swelling there is because that is your dorsal root ganglion. And remember, we said ganglia are clusters of neuron cell bodies that exist in the peripheral nervous system. So those are the locations where you will find cell bodies, not in the spinal cord or the brain. Otherwise, the things that you have inside nerves themselves are going to be the appendages of neurons rather than the cell bodies. All right, and if you notice here within the spinal cord itself, and over on the anatomy side, we're going to talk about the dorsal horns or the posterior horns of the spinal cord, and you've got these anterior horns. Kind of looks like a butterfly configuration there, and these two front areas that extend out are called the anterior or ventral horns, and back here, those little darker areas that extend backwards are the posterior horns or the dorsal horns. Now within there you have cell bodies and axons of interneurons in your dorsal horn. Your ventral horn, though, you have lots and lots of cell bodies of motor neurons that are located generally in those parts of the spinal cord. Darker coloration on the spinal cord there, you've got, that's gray matter in the spinal cord. Remember where you have gray matter in the central nervous system? That's letting you know you have lots of cell bodies in those locations. And then things become even a little bit more localized for, right in here in this part of the ventral horn or anterior horn. That's where your somatic motor neurons, so the motor neurons that control your skeletal muscles, tend to live there. Cell bodies of visceral motor neurons, autonomic motor neurons that control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, they're located generally in that area. And you have this same kind of separation in the dorsal horn. So right in there in blue, that's where your somatic sensory neurons are located, receiving incoming information from the skin, muscles, etc. And then in green, in that VS area, the cell bodies of interneurons that are receiving input from your visceral sensory neurons are located there. All right, so we'll erase all that. So that's just giving you a little bit more of an illustration of the networking that's going on there within the spinal cord. And again, that is a transverse section, a cross section there, so you're seeing a little sliver of the spinal cord. Okay, so within the spinal cord, so you've got those interneurons that are in there, and you've got motor neurons sitting within the spinal cord. The motor neurons have got to receive information in general coming downward from the brain. So within the brain, you've got neurons whose cell bodies are up there, and they have these long axons that are going to extend downward so that they can influence things that are happening down lower in the spinal cord. Also, you've got this incoming information that comes in through those dorsal roots. You have synapses with interneurons in the spinal cord, and then very often those neurons have got to send information upward. They've got to generate action potentials that are going to travel upward and try to tell neurons up in the brain that here's some info you need to process. So within the white matter of the spinal cord, within the white matter areas, remember in white matter you have myelinated axons. And the spinal cord, the white matter, can be divided up into regions, territories for ascending tracts, and there are territories that are descending tracts. So within your ascending tracts, guess what? You have axons that are traveling upward through the spinal cord toward the brainstem and the brain. And in your descending tracts, you have axons that are traveling that way, so carrying impulses from the brain and down to the spinal cord. So they're just kind of showing you there as in general where you find these ascending and descending tracts. And that means that within those areas, the axons tend to be kind of bundled together that are all traveling to similar destinations. And no, you don't need to memorize this map, but most of these are named so that you can kind of tell where they're going. For example, over here you've got the lateral cortico-spinal tract. Spinal is referring to the spinal cord, and cortico is referring to the cortex of the brain, which we'll be talking about later, or maybe you've already run into that if you're doing the anatomy area for Unit 5 first. So the cortico-spinal tract, this little area in here, has a whole bunch of axons that are traveling from the cortex down to the spinal cord. So the first part of the name tells you where those axons originate, and the second part tells you where they're going. Or like over here, you've got the spinothalamic tract. Spino lets you know, and this is an ascending tract, so the axons are starting in the spinal cord and they're headed to, thalamic refers to the thalamus, which is an area down deep in the brain that kind of functions as a routing station. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But again, don't try to memorize this map. I'm just kind of pointing it out to you so that you know within the spinal cord you do have ascending and descending tracts. And also think about injuries to the spinal cord. If you had an injury over here on this side of the spinal cord over in there, you can see that that would affect specific tracts. And so if the axons get sliced in that area and you've got neurons that are dying in those areas due to the injury, it's going to cut off communication between certain areas of the spinal cord and certain areas of the brain. So the section of the spinal cord that becomes injured often dictates how what functions are interrupted due to that injury. You should be able to recognize some of these, such as corticospinal, spinothalamic, spinocerebellar. As you go through and learn the anatomy, you can tell where those ascending tracts and descending tracts are running. So I might ask you a question or two on the test about that, but if you know your anatomy, you'll be able to figure out where those tracts are going. And just remember, the first part of the name tells you where the tract or the axons start, and the second part of the name tells you where they finish. All right, so your ascending pathways in general, so when we're saying we've got an ascending tract, so this is going to be communication going from the spinal cord to the brain. Really, there are 3 neurons in there in general. So even something that's starting down in the lumbar area of the spinal cord, sending impulses up to the brain, there may only be 3 neurons that are part of that network. So some of these axons are going to be extremely long. And one of those neurons is simply, there's the sensory neuron that sent the incoming impulse, the afferent impulse, from the skin, muscles, vital organ, whatever, to the spinal cord. Then you've got an interneuron in the spinal cord that gets stimulated by that sensory neuron. It sends an action potential, boom, upward, and it could be a very long distance. And then that neuron is going to form a sorry about that, my phone was ringing in my office. That neuron is going to form, this one is going to form a synapse with another interneuron in the thalamus or the cerebellum. Okay? So then if it gets stimulated enough, it's going to generate an action potential, and it's going to send it up to a neuron up in the cortex area of the brain. That's up here at the surface of the brain itself, which we'll be learning more about when we discuss the brain in more detail. So that's pretty amazing when you think about it. If you have information coming from way down low in the spinal cord, it only takes 3 neurons in total, say, to communicate you've had a cut on the skin and that's painful. It only takes 3 neurons to get that signal all the way up to the areas of your brain that are going to process that information. And here's another diagram from your textbook, which is showing you, so they're showing you some cross sections here through the spinal cord, and then this is actually a cross section through the brainstem itself. The medulla oblongata is part of the brainstem that you're learning about over on the anatomy side. So they're showing you here, like if somebody was holding a match up to the sole of your foot, hopefully that would never happen, but if it did, you have sensory neurons that are temperature receptors. That's their job. So hot temperatures cause them, they detect that, they generate an action potential, boom. They secrete their neurotransmitters. There's an inner neuron sitting back here in that posterior horn of gray matter there in the spinal cord. It gets stimulated, it reaches threshold, it generates an action potential and sends an impulse way, way, way up the lateral spinothalamic tract. And then that axon is going to form a synapse with an interneuron in the thalamus portion of the brain. That's a deep area of the brain. And same thing with pain receptors. They're showing you over here. Got a sensory neuron whose job it is to detect injury that you should perceive as pain. So when that happens, it generates an action potential. It stimulates an inner neuron here in the spinal cord to generate an action potential that's going to travel all the way up the spinal cord through the brainstem and up into the thalamus portion of the brain. And here they're showing you this diagram from your textbook, the completion of those tracts. So you're coming up for, this is a slice through other parts of the brainstem, and then finally you're up here. This is going to be the main part of the brain. Up here in an area called the thalamus, deep inside the brain, you have some gray matter in there where you have cell bodies of interneurons. And so you can see you've got another synapse there. So these neurons then get stimulated to send action potentials up here to the surface of the brain where you've got lots and lots and lots of cell bodies of neurons that are involved in making important decisions for you. All right, your descending pathways and tracts. What happens with this descending information? Generally that involves 2 neurons. And so you've got what are called, sometimes the top ones are called upper motor neurons. So they're up here in the cortex of the brain. So that's around the whole surface, all those folds and ridges you've got in the main part of the brain. You've got lots of cell bodies of these upper motor neurons up in there. And if they receive enough stimulation, they send action potentials down, descending pathways. And then they form synapses with lower motor neurons. Those are the guys we've talked about before. So these can, those are going to send their axons out to skeletal muscles to try to stimulate them to contract. All right, and so over here they're showing you some examples of some descending pathways. So in these cases, you got neurons whose cell bodies are up here. This is your cortex of the brain, like gray matter there at the surface. You're looking at oops. All right, hang on. I had a crash here with my little drawing program. All right, so you got a lot of these upper motor neurons up here in the cortex area. That's at the surface of the main part of the brain. And so if they receive enough stimulation, they will send action potentials down through the brain. This is actually supposed to represent the cerebellum, which is a brain area you'll learn about over on the anatomy side. This is part of the brain stem. So we're heading down. And now we're moving down into the spinal cord. And notice that this axon over here of that upper motor neuron crosses over from the left side to the right side and forms a synapse down in the spinal cord. There's a little interneuron there that gets involved, and then it sends an action potential that stimulates the motor neuron that controls this muscle over on this side of the body. And if we erase all of that, change pen colors back to blue over here, the axon of this upper motor neuron travels down through the spinal cord, comes down in here, and then notice it flips over, changes sides in the spinal cord, forms a synapse with a motor neuron that controls a muscle on that side of the body. And notice those axons of the motor neurons. The second motor neuron there travels out through the ventral root. So outgoing fibers travel through the ventral root and then enter the main part of the spinal nerve. So that's an example of a descending pathway. Notice the crossing over that takes place. So you may have heard before that the left side of your brain controls things that happens on the right side, that happen on the right side of the body. Right side of the brain controls things that happen over on the left side of the body, and you can see why here the axons of those upper motor neurons, they cross over from one side to the other before they tell a motor neuron, hey, you need to stimulate a muscle contraction to take place. All right. Okay, another little briefly here, another little topic here, innervation of your skin. So you've got these nerves that extend out to the skin, and you've got axons of sensory neurons that exist within those nerves, and they're carrying their incoming action potentials, those incoming impulses toward the spinal cord. All right, so certain areas of the skin are going to be served by branches of particular spinal nerves. All right, so over on the anatomy side, you're learning that your spinal nerves, the main ones that branch off of the spinal cord, are named according to the vertebrae around which they branch off of the spinal cord. So all of those spinal nerves except for C1, that's your uppermost spinal nerve branch, participate in what are called dermatomes. Dermatomes are areas of the skin that are innervated by particular single spinal nerves. Now you do have some overlaps between these, but this information can be used to generate a map, and that's what you're seeing here. So when you're looking at this map and you see like T2 over here and over here, the areas that are highlighted in T2 are served by, which actually those, I didn't draw those on there correctly. Let me erase all that. Hang on. Go away. Erase. Which actually would be around your axillary areas here are served by T2, like right there and right over there. That means that those areas there around your armpits, the sensory nerves through which you would feel pain, their axons travel toward the spinal cord through spinal nerve T2. That's the main spinal nerve branch. Same thing down in here. All those areas you see that are within the borders for T10, the sensory neurons that serve that area and that strip around the lower abdomen, their axons will all travel through nerve branches off of T10, the T10 spinal nerve. So these are called dermatomes. That's useful information because if you are going to do surgery or some other type of medical procedure on a patient and you need to deaden particular spinal nerves, you know, generally, depending on the area where you're doing the procedure, which of those spinal nerves need to be deadened. And there is some overlap, so I think they go one above and one below, just to make sure if they're deadening spinal nerves that they hit all the right ones. So that kind of roadmap for your senses there, those are called dermatomes. All right, the next little video lecture, we're going to talk about some reflex arcs, and these are in general the most simple type of networking between a sensory neuron, interneurons, and motor neurons. And many of these work straight through the spinal cord. They don't even involve the brain for decision making. So we'll talk about those in the next video lecture as we continue to talk about our neuron networking.